Mike Wilson here, the host of the Stutter with Confidence podcast, and I'm happy today to be joined by Peter Loew. Peter, if you would, for those that don't know you, tell people where you're from and what you do.
Yes, I'm from South Africa. I live in Cape Town, which is the southern part of Africa. It's a seaside city. I'm retired. I worked for an insurance company for decades, for many years. I am a qualified lawyer, but due to my inability to use the telephone, I found that just too hard at the time. That was when I was much younger, of course. And yeah, so I did various things. I was a journalist. I did lots of translating, also as a freelancer. And so I've moved mostly into the language field, which is actually my main love and interest. And of course, because of the limitations which stuttering created for me, I'm also very interested in stuttering as a disorder. And yeah, so that's really me in a nutshell.
And in terms of those limitations, were you, well, it sounds like you were like many of us, vast majority of us, I think, who stutter went through a significant stage where we were avoiding speaking, where we told ourselves, if I'm going to stutter, then I can't pick up that phone and have this conversation. Looking back, do you think that limitation that you felt when you were, when you were younger, and obviously you went to law school, so you were planning on being a lawyer, but the phone was a big problem. Do you think that with your, well, and was your stutter like not able to get out a word for 2 minutes? Was it that severe, or was it somewhere in between well, what was the severity, would you say, of your stutter when you were younger?
Yeah, it's difficult to evaluate a stutter. I think any stutter is difficult to grade because I mean I had lots of fluency also, but my blocks were very severe and still are. If I go into a block, I can feel my vocal cords really getting into a very strong freeze. I am very sensitive to stress and tension, and that really gets to me. So yeah, but when I was younger, it was much worse. I couldn't use the phone. I really couldn't because of the extreme blocks. And but actually, I don't want to focus too much on my previous years because that can easily become a bit of victimhood. I wrote 2 books, and in my first book, I went into detail about all the terrible problems I had with my stutter and my the various jobs which I tried to do and couldn't speak. And but since then, yeah, that first book actually gave me the opportunity to express all that and get it out of my system. And that I really found very therapeutic, because and yeah, and I still strongly believe that expressing your emotions and your repressed feelings, not only about speech and stuttering, but about all kinds of things. Expressing those feelings as much as possible is extremely helpful. And I can remember when I finished my first book, which is freely online at the moment, I experienced a huge improvement in fluency. And that fluency has continued to a very large extent. I'm not 100% fluent, but that first book and that getting out all the horrible things, all the unpleasantness, I really got that out of my system. And it's so important for all of us, I think, is to get it out, to express yourself, to get that poison out.
Yeah, I know what you're saying, and I do a lot of that with this podcast where I, to talk about some of those old memories when I was very much running away from stuttering moments when I was a child, well, up until the age of 18. And for me, I had an in-between stage. So from the time I realized I had a stutter at age 11, started to care about it, started to try not to stutter, which of course made it much harder to speak in very short order. And literally within a few months of when I started trying hard not to stutter, my stutter got so much more severe fast when I was 11. And then from then until through the end of high school at the age of 18, my mission in life was to hide my stutter. So I wasn't using the phone. I wasn't going up to talk to people. I was avoiding situations. I was very much, my goal was to hide my stutter. Fool people that I was a normal fluent speaker as best I could, but I had a really good stutter going, as I like to call it, as opposed to a bad stutter. And but that was my whole existence during those years. And then I got what could be called assertiveness training. I call it eye contact training. My first year at Florida State University, where they brought me around campus and had me ask people questions, just random questions. Where's the bathroom? Where's the library? That sort of stuff. And keep eye contact when I stutter. So in other words, Peter, to model it rather than going, excuse me, where's the bathroom? It was, excuse me, where's the bathroom? And for me, that was a game-changing habit. When I got to the point where I could face that thing I was so afraid of, which was other people's reaction, what are people gonna think when I start stuttering, right? Because in my mind, it was still the bully on the playground when I was 11 years old. That's what the whole world must think about my stutter, is what I thought. And, I would never, for example, answer the phone when I was in high school, ever. I'd just sprint away from it because I couldn't say hello. And, I didn't want to stutter. I would rather run away which is understandable. I think almost all of us have gone through that period. But for me, I still stuttered a lot, even though I found my confidence. And I was like, I'm going to say what I want. I'm not going to continue to live in a social prison where I can't say the things I want to say just because I stutter. I don't know how to control my stutter. None of the speech therapists have been able to teach me that. So, damn it, I'm just going to say it anyway. And I realized people were so much nicer than I thought they were going to be. Most people, once they realized I had a stutter, would hang in there. And even as a dentist, growing my practices, and I interviewed, now there's maybe 30 dentists or so that work in my practices that I own. And for the first 10 years of that, I had the really good stutter. So I'd do my phone calls and talk look like that, but always finish my sentences and say what I wanted. And I actually found that people trusted me fast when I was talking like that. And the confidence, as you know, I know you're a big believer in the unconscious, right? The things that we're not conscious of. And I think Freud was huge on that, right? Freud sort of changed Western thinking on that, from what I understand. And so there's a lot of human communication and vibes, so to speak, right, which are unconscious, which we're just not even aware of. It's probably just, baked right into our evolution. Things like smiles or, scowl. I mean, all the facial expressions certainly are a part of that. And eye contact is one also, right? Let's assume, I think it's probably safe to assume that our species was looking at each other long before they figured out we've got the apparatus here to speak and create language, and certainly eye contact matters in the animal kingdom. And, I would assume a lot of what's happening with animals probably is unconscious, right? They probably don't have the sort of thoughts that we do, at least not in the language anyway. But yeah, so anyway, I noticed I never thought about it in these terms per se, in the unconscious, but all those unconscious vibes, or most of them, really changed once I changed the way that I looked at it, essentially, and was like, look, if you have a problem with my stutter, no worries. Go work somewhere else, or go hang out with somebody else. No problem. If I knew how to control it, I would, but I don't. And I'm not just going to zip it because because I have a stutter. But any thoughts on that? In particular, on that unconscious side of human communication, things that maybe neither party are even aware of, where when we're confident, when we're assertive, and that's right, that eye contact is certainly assertive, even if I'm struggling to get words out like that. What I've experienced is people are so much more likely to stay with you than when I'm doing this or looking away and I'm ashamed.
Yeah. I think that for you, the eye contact was a game changer. It was because eye contact is part of assertiveness. It's because if you look at somebody's eyes, you communicate. It's perhaps unconsciously and consciously, but there is communication. There are things going on there. You are facing the threat or the danger or whatever, because other people in our minds can be a threat. They can be a danger. And but by looking at that threat, you face it. You assert yourself. And I think that's where Dr. Sarno comes in, because his basic premise is that mind-body problems are mostly caused by a repression, which is a mindset in which you hold back. You hold back, which is the exact opposite of letting out and expressing. So for me at least, expressing is the exact opposite of repressing, of going back into yourself. And I think that's what I've been doing for, since I was a little boy. I repressed, I held back. And now, as I'm older, maybe I wish I had known this when I was much younger. But now I'm trying to let it out, to be more expressive in my thinking and, of course, in my speech also.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And as you know, John Harrison is big on this as well. And I think there's a lot of value there, that just in some ways developing new habits where we don't hold back. If we want to say it, say it. If we want to do it, do it, sort of dive into it. And I like the analogies with sports. An athlete that's holding back, that's playing scared, that's not going for it, is never going to reach his or her full potential. It's just not possible. And sort of let people know that don't, they're not familiar with your work. Peter, you run the Facebook group. Is it Stuttering as a mind-body disorder?
Yes, that's.
Gotcha. Okay. So if you would give people an overview of your theory on stuttering as a mind-body disorder.
Yeah. Look, it's not really my theory. I'm just applying the ideas of Dr. Sarno to stuttering. And of course, it's not only Dr. Sarno. He's gradually gained a following, and at the moment, within the medical field, there are many people, many physicians who believe that his principles are correct. And yeah, so Dr. Sarno's main view was that the mind can affect the body just as much as the body can affect the mind. And look, there are many things many disorders, physical disorders, which we all already know are mind-body issues. The one well-known is the irritable bowel syndrome, and many other digestive issues, many of them. There are many unexplained medical disorders, and many of them apparently seem to be seem to be what Dr. Sarno called TMS.
And what is, people that don't know, what does that stand for?
Yeah, that's also a story. In the beginning, he called it tension myositis syndrome. Now, myositis means inflammation of the muscles. Then later on, he changed it to tension myoneural syndrome because he found that not only muscles but only other body tissues are can be affected by tension. And then now these days, TMS really stands for the mind-body syndrome, because the doctors who believe in this say that about any body part can be affected by tension and stress. So all I've been doing is that I'm saying that not only the digestive system can be affected by stress and tension, but also the muscles of our speech, and especially the vocal cords, which seem to be the core problem behind stuttering. So that's really what I've been saying, and of course it's difficult to prove all this, because there's a huge psychological aspect to it, and things within psychology it's not so easy to prove them as when it comes to the physical world. But I have no reason to doubt what I'm saying. I think that tension affects our vocal cords, and this starts when we are very young. We might be 2 years old, 3 years old, 4 years old, or later, and that's when it starts. As you know, the vocal cords are situated in the larynx, and now here's another theory which is by Dr. Martin Schwartz, who found that the vocal cords of people who stutter are extremely sensitive to tension and stress of all kinds. So it seems to me that when we are about 2 to 5 years old, that we tense our vocal cords, and they go into freeze mode. They actually lock together, and they go in. They just freeze, and our stuttering, our the lips that can't move, and our tongue which does funny things, that's all actually secondary behavior in an effort to unlock and resolve the vocal cords. That was Dr. Schwartz's theory. So what I've been doing is I've been combining Dr. Schwartz with Dr. Sarno. And that seems to be, for me, a very simple explanation. Our stress and our tension is directed to our vocal cords. They go into freeze mode, and as a result, we make do all kinds of struggle behavior in an effort to release the vocal cords, which have blocked here. Yeah.
I gotcha. And so essentially you found an approach on the mind side and an approach on the body side, and so you're hitting both sides of the challenge, if you will. And I don't know, I had a good chat, for example, with Chris Constantino on the podcast, and we were talking about the neurological and the psychological in the stuttering discussion. And a lot of people, it seems, want to and I understand the urge, but they want to make those polar opposite things. No, the neurological is physical, basically, or genetic, and the psychological is sort of at the other end of the spectrum. But as I mentioned with Chris, and I think he agrees with, um, it's really hard, in my opinion, to separate those two, right? The mind and the body swim in the same soup. And
Absolutely.
like an athlete, for example, right? If an athlete is scared up here, there's no chance he or she is going to reach their physical potential on the field or the court, right? When the mind is in a certain, well, in sports, it can be especially counterproductive or negative, which I think is, and I'm a believer in that too. I mean, I can just, at times in my life when I'm super worried up here or the wheels are turning, and I'm sure there's also a lot of unconscious stuff happening, I can feel my body feels worse, like mind and the body are on a string together, as far as I can tell. Now, that's not to say that everything is necessarily interrelated. Like, it's not to say that everybody's cancer or everybody's, MS or whatever is just all from mind stuff. But, certainly it's all linked in there. And for me, something that for me really, I feel like connected, I think of our breathing as sitting right in the middle of our mind and our body. It seems to have an impact on both, and whether it's yoga or meditation, for example, for thousands of years, humans have been noticing seemingly our breathing is connected with our mind somehow. And, you look at movies and shows, when the actors are, one of the tricks they use to convey what their character is feeling is their breathing. I never noticed how much of it happens, but like, and I'm not an actor, but if the actor's going, that means something, right? When the actor is going, a big sigh, that means something. When the actor goes, like a big gasp, that means something, right? When they're conveying what their character's experiencing in their mind, oftentimes the breathing is one of the avenues with which they show that to the audience. And I've noticed in my journey, even though I learned, and it's a form of deep breathing that I use, which comes from an opera singer in the Netherlands originally in the 1970s, called coastal breathing, which then was picked up by some other programs like Starfish and McGuire, and so it's a very deep breathing approach. Essentially, it's kind of like yawn breathing, if you will, right? Anybody wonders what happens when you yawn, right? Well, mouth gets open wide, you take a massive breath, and I think all of us have experienced something happens in a yawn, right? It hasn't been studied much by medicine because it's not a problem. So, sort of like sighing. I don't think modern science and medicine really understands exactly why we do those things, but we do them, and we know there's an impact. And so the way I have found, and from a mindfulness standpoint, I think I've sort of taken it, or at least I think of it in a way beyond what some of the other programs that use that form of breathing think about it. But to me, it's totally a bridge between my mind and my body. And it's a way when my body's feeling tension, big, deep, disciplined, fairly slow, smooth breath, particularly with the release. There's few things that are more relaxing that human beings can do than a big release of air. And that's another thing that you see actors do all the time when they're acting, when they're trying to show that their character, is processing some super stressful situation, and they're trying to convey to the audience that they're that they're calming themselves down, that they're getting their wits about them, that they're, finding their poise. A lot of times you'll see them do a big breath with a big release in particular. And so I've found that really, when my mind decides I'm going to take that big soothing breath and release, my body feels it immediately. Vice versa, when my body then feels that feedback loop then goes back and helps to soothe my mind. So it's like those two are happening simultaneously. And so I'm a big believer in both the mind and the body, in that you can't separate them. It's not even practical to fully separate them, though I understand why science needs to try to separate them and figure out what's influencing what here, what's happening. Because, like you said, science, and part of why this mind-body thing probably, you never want to predict the future, but it's going to be very difficult to ever prove all this fully, right? Because it's in this space, it's very hard for science to get at the mind exactly, right? The mind seems to be, for example, where do our thoughts, like, why does one thought pop into our mind, but not another thought? And then 5 minutes later, some other, like, as we all know, thoughts are just constantly seemingly emerging from the ether, right? Well, that's probably popping up from our neurology, from our brain chemistry, from everything. But it's, a lot of this is going to be very difficult probably to ever fully prove. Do you agree with that?
Yes. And also those thoughts also come from the unconscious mind.
Right, exactly. And is the unconscious mind separate from our neurology and our brain chemistry and all that, right? It's probably all swimming in the same soup, I suspect.
Yes, I also think that that the psychology and neurology are really two sides of the same coin. It's really like you said, it's really part of the bigger whole.
Yeah. I mean, and bring it back to sports again. When you get that pass in basketball and you're thinking, I don't think I'm going to make this shot. Well, that thought, or maybe it's an unconscious thing. You're not even thinking it, but your unconscious is remembering when you missed another big shot in the past, and that adds some level of tension to your legs, to your arms, all that stuff, right? And the unconscious, the conscious, and the body, right? The actual machinery with which our experience sits on top of is, first of all, it's a beautiful thing. It's amazing that we're even here to, talk to each other and, be alive in the first place, I think. But it's also, from a scientific standpoint, I think it's going to be very challenging to ever fully get that. But, humans are pretty smart, and we're pretty hardworking, and we're pretty, ingenuitive, a lot of ingenuity. And so I suspect we're going to inch closer to it over time. And I really do, I don't disagree at all, Peter, with your basic premise. I'm not a big believer in the vocal, from a speech mechanism. I think there's three big things that are involved, right? Physically, in order to make human speech, you need airflow, right? If you cut off the airflow of any person on earth, they would be a stutterer immediately, because you can't do it without airflow, right? Those vocal folds require air flowing over them. You can't even whisper. You can't even whisper if there's no voice whatsoever. You can't whisper without airflow, right? And I used to stutter even when I'd whisper, so with no voice whatsoever, I would still stutter like that. So for full human voice, and I've known people that lose their vocal folds, and all they can do is whisper. I knew one fellow that was maybe in his 80s or so when I was a kid. All he could do was whisper. There was no, vocal fold, vibratory voice going on anymore. But for the full human speech, if you will, you need airflow, you need the vocal folds vibrating, doing their thing, and then you need articulation, right? If I'm, obviously if I had mouthwash in my mouth right now and trying to talk to you without moving my articulators, you wouldn't understand what I'm saying, right? Because you got to articulate it too. So those are the three, I think, pillars, the three things that need to happen. And from my perspective, it's what's happening in general in those moments for whatever reason. Obviously, this might be debated. It has been debated many, many thousands of hours with regards to stuttering, but for whatever reason, we're holding back in those moments, right? You take away the people, and suddenly the vast majority of us don't, stutter at all, which has recently been confirmed by a study from Eric Jackson and Scott Uris. I think maybe for the first time ever, we've confirmed that, yeah, sure enough, people that stutter most stop stuttering when they think nobody's listening, which is very interesting, right? The speech mechanism clearly is intact, clearly works. Now, there are exceptions to this. I've met some people that say they still stutter when they're alone. But it's, so for what, and that was always the great mystery for many of us who stutter, myself included. Why, when you take away the people, does the speech mechanism work just fine? And then you put the people back in the room, and especially depending on who's in the room, right? For many, their boss, or say somebody that they're interested in romantically, who they want to impress, that concern about judgment, which is a very human, social sort of thing, seems to have a huge impact on our ability to move forward with our speech. And what are your thoughts on that? I mean, obviously this is, that repression versus expression, right? Being expressive and assertive versus repressing. What are your thoughts on that as to why there's such a massive difference between when nobody's listening, or we think nobody's listening? In this study that Eric Jackson and Scott Uris and a couple others did, they were able to convince people in those moments. Like, people thought they were alone. They thought, they thought it was on a break, and I forget the details. People genuinely thought they were alone, and lo and behold, 99% of their stuttering vanished.
Yeah, but there is a minority of people who do stutter even while alone, and I think it's important that we ask why. Why do they stutter while alone? And for me, that it seems that the reason seems obvious. It's that they are still holding back, and I would suggest that they are severe stutterers. That they really repress and hold back severely, even while alone. And unfortunately, they are still, even while alone, they are still holding back. They are still freezing up, and that could be. These things start when we are very young. When we are 3 or 4 years old or 5 years old. And one has to go and look at one's childhood and see what was going on there. Maybe there was some tension with the parents. There may have been a traumatic experience, but most of all, we also have to look at our personalities. I mean, as I've been saying, most of people who stutter are also highly sensitive persons, HSPs. that is a generally, within psychology, that is now generally accepted, that there is that some people, or actually many people, it's about one fifth of the broad population are HSPs, but within the stuttering community, that figure rises to 4 out of 5 persons.
And Peter, just to jump in real quick, so that has been studied, if you will, by the experts in a peer-reviewed and published sort of way.
Yes. The HSP pioneer is Dr. Elaine Aron. She is very well known within psychology, and she was the pioneer. She thinks she wrote her first books in the 1990s or so, and that has now generally been established. And then a speech therapist, a speech specialist with the name of Libby Oyler, she did the research on HSP and stuttering, and she found that about 4 out of 5 stuttering children are HSPs. And for some reason, that is not within the stuttering community, that is not heard much. People don't talk about that because I think it's because it's not politically correct to say such things, to focus on the psychology. But I think it's an extremely important point that most people who stutter are highly sensitive, and this being a highly sensitive person is not just the result of our speech problem. We are born with that. It's an inborn thing, and we probably got it from our parents to some extent. In some extent, sensitivity is also a result, I'm sure, of the speech issue, but it's mainly inborn, so, and it's part of our personality. And I think there's at least one professor in speech pathology who has acknowledged this, and who said that high sensitivity is a factor in the onset of stuttering, and that people who are highly sensitive, what's the word I'm looking for? They are predisposed. They are predisposed to develop a stutter while young, and probably while older too.
So that's interesting. And one question I would have, because, well, what about the 80%? From what I understand, roughly 80%, 75, 80% of 4-year-olds that are stuttering will not grow up to be adults who stutter. So in other words, 80% of people will, quote, outgrow it. And what I understand, that's, with or without speech therapy. Most kids will just outgrow their stuttering. The study that you were referencing, and well, for those that want to find that, what was the name of the person that did the research on the children that stutter and found a high percent?
Libby Oyler, yeah.
Libby Oyler, okay. So was that on kids who were, say, 4 or 5, like sort of before the iceberg has formed, or was that on kids after? Because I would wonder, just, for the purposes of, sort of this conversation and what popped in my head, and it wouldn't surprise me at all, because I can tell you for sure that teenagers and adults of the you know, north of 1,000 folks who stutter that I've known and had conversations with, there's a intense hypersensitivity in a high percentage of folks to those stuttering moments and what other people will think and all that. And so I would wonder, and John Harrison speaks about this also, that he was a really sensitive young man and really, it led him to hold back in a lot of ways. I was the same way. I was also like that in sports as a young boy, really up until I got to the age of 17. I would hold back in sport, even though I played sports, I liked them, but I wasn't a hustler. I wasn't just gonna dive in there and really go hard, and it was a holding back thing. And I had that in a variety of ways in my life. I would wonder if of those 80% of 4-year-olds that end up, outgrowing their stutter, is there probably a much lower percentage of those kids that had that highly sensitive person designation. In other words, they didn't develop a giving a damn, if you will, about their disfluencies. And how do most non-stuttering people deal with stuttering moments? Like when they have an especially disfluent moment, most people are like, ha ha ha, I can't even talk right now. And then they move on, right? They don't care. They're not, So I wonder, of the 20% who persists, one question, if it hasn't been researched already, if if there are ways to monitor or to measure whether the 4-year-old is a highly sensitive 4-year-old, I would imagine there probably are ways of measuring that. Of those, all the kids that are stuttering, or at least, the sample group in a study, if you figure that out for all of those 4-year-old children that are stuttering and then track them to the long term, and of the 20% that outgrows it, if they were, or the 80% that outgrows it, were they disproportionately not hypersensitive children as 4-year-olds? And of the 20% that doesn't outgrow it, were they disproportionately, a hypersensitive 4-year-olds when you look back at where they were at?
Yeah, my hypothesis there is that those children who outgrow it have somehow stopped repressing. They may have held back when they were younger, but they at some stage of their development, they stopped repressing. It might also be, look, it's not only a matter of anxiety, it's also a matter of stress. Some of those children may have been, their stress levels may have been quite high at the time of onset, but as they got older, their stress levels may have gone down. For instance, things in their circumstances. Their parents might have given them a small dog or a cat, and which kind of, that may sound funny, but I've heard of at least one young child who had a stutter, and after being given a pet, the stutter vanished. So that, that feelings of warmth and of friendship with the pet may have solved his introversion, his holding back, his emotional repression, and may have allowed him to come out of himself. Now, you know, things like that. A child who has been given a pet, maybe when the child had the onset, his parents were were in circumstances of tension or stress, but after a while those stress factors improved. I heard about one child who lost his stutter when he went to another school which apparently he fit in better than compared to the old school, or he got a friend, or you know, whereas previously he had no friends. I know of one child who lost his stutter when his dad, who was divorced at the time, when his dad took him for a fishing trip. You know, those may be small things, but for a young child, it could mean the whole world.
I definitely know what you're saying there. And I would add that, you know, if 80% of kids are outgrowing their stutter, then it's going to happen at some point for those 80%. And the old thing, you know, a correlation doesn't necessarily mean causation, right? So I have no doubt that those sort of things could, you know, very well be the deciding factor. I mean, I think it's certainly possible, but obviously in every individual case, it's difficult to prove what exactly it was, right? Maybe that child was just going to outgrow their stutter when they were 6 and it wasn't the dog or it wasn't the fishing trip. But I think the principle of, well, and this can apply with anything almost in life, right? People have turning points, and something happened at that age. For example, with my learning how to hustle. Remember, I said as a kid, I didn't play that hard at sports. I was a little bit lazy out there, but it wasn't just laziness. It was like holding back. Well, I could do this or I could do this, and by the time I'm sitting there done analyzing it, the play's already happened and I can't do anything because I'm sitting back, holding back, sort of a thing. But for me, that changed one summer between my junior and my senior year of high school. And I would, you know, I'll just put it out there. It's legal now in much of the United States, but I started smoking marijuana between my junior and senior year of high school. And that whole summer, me and my 2 close friends would go out to a, you know, public basketball goal, and we would smoke and just play basketball for hours. And I finally realized, I finally learned how to hustle that summer because I was sort of, a little bit out of my mind, so to speak. And I was just like, it finally occurred to me, Michael, you need to just react. Like, just react to what's going on and make a decision fast and go, just go. And finally it clicked. Now, who knows that, was it those friends that, because those were the only 2 people in school at that point that I was comfortable speaking with and hanging out with. I was comfortable around them. It was blazing hot, the Georgia summer heat. And also going from 17 to 18, I was developing more physically. So maybe it was testosterone levels starting to go up as you become a man. Maybe it was the marijuana. Who knows exactly what caused me something to click in my head where I learned for the first time how to hustle. And from that moment on, I was, like, I play as hard as anybody in sports. I just got it. right? But it could be tricky to say what that was exactly, because there's always multiple factors going on, including us just, especially as children, just growing up, right? And you go, and I've seen it with my 4 kids. I mean, they go from one stage into the next, and all of a sudden they're doing new stuff, and they're seem to be thinking in a new way. And it's, this evolution of childhood is a little, um, it's a little hard to know why exactly something happened.
Well, I think that the marijuana could have been an important factor, because marijuana and alcohol too, they tend to reduce inhibition, and inhibition and repression are very closely interrelated. If you know what I mean, because like I said, Dr. Sarno's core concept is that repression is behind it all. So if you suddenly become less inhibited, you're also going to become less repressed. You're going to let it out. You're going to free you're going to free your mind. You're going to open up your mind. I'm not saying that marijuana is a good thing, and not at all, not at all. But I do know that many people have said that alcohol and marijuana and such things, they can result in less inhibition and more opening up the mind, and opening up those chains, those heavy chains that have been locked us in since we were very young.
Oh, and yes, as a disclaimer on that note, I'm not promoting anybody to go out and start using any substances either. But to your point there, I mean, how many great songs were written in the 60s and 70s?
Yes.
The Beatles, for example, when they started, and again, I'm not saying everybody or anybody really should rush out and start doing this, but it's well documented that when the Beatles started experimenting with drugs, their music obviously changed a lot. You can see it, in those albums. I think 65 or so was when the transition started, 65, 66. And I mean, a lot of creativity certainly has come out of musicians, for example, when they're in altered states of mind. And it's just they're in a new sort of realm of existence, so to speak, which, as we spoke about, I think before we started the podcast, pros and cons, right? There can be obviously serious cons of a lot of these hard drugs, and it can ruin lives. But the mind, and Timothy Leary spoke about this also, and and obviously a very controversial figure from the 1950s and 60s with LSD, but LSD is another substance that it's sort of, in some ways, it sort of rips your mind wide open. And it can go in awful directions or some very positive directions also, or everywhere in between. But, the mind is truly a fascinating thing. And,
Look,
yep.
Yeah, I'm actually a believer in natural things. I think sports. The Roman principle of a healthy mind in a healthy body. That makes absolute sense to me, and I'm definitely not in favor of LSD or drugs or or marijuana, because now because we, or at least I know that repression and inhibition and holding back is behind my stutter, and because I know that I don't need such I don't need LSD or drugs. I can simply by being aware of the root cause, like a repression and inhibition, I can help myself. I can heal myself. Uh,
And
of no.
well, and you use journaling for that also, right, Peter, from what I've seen?
Sorry.
You use journaling as a part of how
Oh, yes,
you
yes,
have done
yes,
that, right? You know, sitting
yes.
down and just, and when you're journaling, especially in those moments that you feel are most productive, are you, is it sort of like stream of consciousness? You know, you're just sort of, well, do you have a particular technique or approach to getting yourself to journal in a productive way? So when you're doing it, is there a technique like, you know, I'm going to think about that tough experience when I was 12, and just whatever comes up is what I will write? I mean, is that the sort of thing that you do, or how do
Yeah.
you do?
Look, there are many ways of journaling. You know, there are many forms of journaling. Um, but I mostly, and I don't journal much. I do it for about 10 minutes a day, or even 5 minutes, I just write down things which have worried me that particular day, which have given me concern, because I need to get that out of my system. But I know that you know, some people go very deep into this. They go very deep into journaling. They go into their what happened to them when they were still very young, and you know, unpleasant experiences, traumatic experiences. Um, one has to be a bit careful with journaling too, and not everybody finds it helpful. For some people who have been traumatized, it can actually re-traumatize them. So and it can actually be more disconcerting for them. So it's definitely not for everybody. I've done some deep journaling which actually upset me. You know, it really made me unhappy. So these days I just journal a bit more more superficial, really, because I don't want my problems to be made worse. You know?
Right. And it's what you're saying, that it can be on the possible negative side, like a dwelling on those really difficult
Mm.
things, rather than the point of it, which is to move on from those things. But if it's making you dwell more and get stuck, you know, sort of back in those moments in a way, that's not productive.
Yeah, because I've what I found with journaling is that the intensity of one's fears can be really very intense. And when I say very intense, I mean extremely upsetting. I've been shocked by my own fears. Um, when one shouldn't underestimate them, and also the extent of one's fantasies, of one's repressions. Because many of us, or I am at least, I think I have a repressive personality. I try to keep it down, you know. Even though my own childhood was actually quite happy, you know. I had wonderful parents, but sensitive people they tend to be they tend to fantasize, and also in a bad way. They tend to fantasize about everything that can go wrong and all the nightmares of the future. For instance, I'm now 71 years old. I know I'm going to die at some stage. It might be in about 10 years or 20 years. So I sometimes I can't help fantasizing about, will I get sick? Will I get cancer? Will it be painful? What's going to happen to my wife, to my son? How are they going to live or to die? How can I handle that? How will they handle that? If you really start thinking about all the things that can go wrong in your life or in the life of the ones you love, you can make for yourself a real hell on earth, and you can generate lots of very intense fears. And
Right. And well, my experience with that, and I used to, well, when I was 11, um, my little brother died, and it's probably not a coincidence. That was right around the same age when I started becoming super concerned about my stutter. Um, but I also became super concerned real fast about what happens to us after we die. I was like, okay, David's gone, and it hit home that people can just die just like that, even with zero warning whatsoever that it's coming, here 1 second, gone the next. And I was like, wait, that means that could happen to me, right? You see something like that happen, and then, for all you know, it's about to happen to you or somebody else that you love. And so at that age, at 11, 12 years old, I started thinking a lot about the afterlife. Was there one? Was hell real? And if it was, I didn't want to risk, burning there for eternity, that sort of thing. A good, I grew up going to church a good bit, as a Catholic, and so those questions are brought up, and it during those years, I haven't thought about this too much. I haven't talked about it on the podcast, but during those years when my stutter, when I was so, use your word, repressed and not saying the vast majority of the things I wanted to say in life, I was also really concerned about death. And not necessarily afraid that I was about to die, but just knowing that it could happen at any time, and having a sense of urgency. I need to figure out what I believe so that if it does happen, I don't, eternally screw myself, so to speak. And so I thought a lot about that, and it bothered me a lot. And it was, in a way, it was dwelling on the future. Now, that could be a long future in theory, right? Eternity. But nonetheless, so I got in college, again, when I was coming out of that, holding back. I was still stuttering, but, decided I'm going to say what I want from a speech standpoint. Also, I found a worldview which has stuck with me these 25 years, that look, obviously we can't do anything about the past. What's done is done. I can't fast forward time and do anything about, for example, how I'm going to deal with it if I get a crazy, painful form of cancer and have 5 years of brutal life at the end of my life, which, might happen to any of us, right? Obviously it's understandable that when you're, in your 70s, it's possibly closer than it is when somebody's younger, but it can happen to anybody. I have a good friend of mine whose wife got breast cancer when she was 35 and was gone in 9 months. But this ability, and this is very much, taught in Buddhism. I'm not a Buddhist, but that ability to focus on now. Because as we're sitting here thinking about what bad things might happen in the future, I've got 4 kids, you know, I mean, there's no level of worry greater than worrying about our kids, I think. You know, how they're going to turn out, all that kind of stuff, at least for me. But what's important now? What's important now? You know, that acronym WHEN. What's important now? And when we can focus on the now, and that's another thing that the breathing is super powerful for, I think, that seems to have an ability to bring us back to the here and now, because suddenly we're aware of what's happening with our body, fundamental process in our body. And I find that ability to be in the moment. Because the thing is, when I'm sitting here worried, oh, you know, what's going to happen with my kids when they get older? Well, meanwhile, I'm not noticing that, you know, funny thing they just did, or that cute thing they just did, or I'm not present in the moment, right? I don't see the beauty of the snowflakes as they're falling outside, right? There's all these things. And, you know, so what do you think about that idea, that ability to be present in the moment, which is obviously, you know, a very Eastern way of thinking, right? Buddhism, Hinduism, some of these ancient traditions, that ability to get in the moment and to be here now, and not, you know, because in some way, right, you know, and statistically, Peter, you know, I don't know what the chances are, but there's probably at least a 30% chance that either you or I, you know, or any other 2 people sitting here are gonna have a tough ending to our life, right? Because it happens sometimes, for sure. You know, hopefully I just die in my, you know, I'm healthy till I'm 92 and then I die in my sleep. That'd be the ideal. But you know, it's not always how it goes. And so, you know, or whatever it is, we're gonna have something tough in our future. That's just life, right? It's life. But to ruin now, the current moment, when I'm feeling good and, you know, things are good, to ruin the current moment with worrying about the hypothetical shitty future moment is really a waste of the current moment, obviously, right? And I don't, you know, I think a lot of the project of life and how to enjoy our life and how to live to the fullest is knowing how to, you know, one, let go of the past, right? Not bring the past forward into the current moment to where we're dwelling on stuff that we totally have no impact over, which is the past, or to a too great of an extent dwelling in the future and having that anxiety and stress and worry. And just meanwhile, you know, look, I can take a good breath right now. I'm feeling pretty good. You know, what do you think about that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's just that one has to express these fears. You know, I think the problem come with people who do have fears, but you know, these universal fears of death and of pain and whatever. But they keep it to themselves. They hold it back, and they should just express it in, you know, by like with through conversations like we're having now, like with meditation and religion, things like that. You know, I think there are definitely ways to deal with fears. The only thing I'm saying is that that one should not underestimate the strength of those fears. They are very real, and they have to be addressed.
That makes total sense. So, Peter, we've chatted a little longer than we were planning on here. Is there anything that, well, before we wrap it up, is there anything that we we didn't talk about that you'd like to speak about before we
I,
finish up?
I think we have covered the main things. um, yeah, no, there is. I I remember that you were a bit uncertain about the vocal cords and why we don't stutter when we whisper, or and that some people do stutter even while whispering. There is an explanation for that. Dr. Schwartz mentioned it, and but it gets a bit technical. But I mention it in my book, in my second book. It's quite interesting.
Gotcha. And
Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
um, so it's kind of complicated. Well, and I'll just say, for me on the vocal side, um, what I do on the vocalization side of it is basically it's that John Harrison project your voice when in doubt, raise your volume a little bit, not yelling, obviously, not being rude or anything, but when in doubt, increase your volume a bit, project your voice with that no holding back, right? Like
Yeah.
there's an expression in some of the martial arts. I haven't done it, but a couple of people that have spent a lot of time in the martial arts have told me there's an expression that they've heard fairly commonly: relax and explode. And that's how I think about that's the speech approach that I use, which was very valuable. Is relax, and for me that's release of air. That's also getting that, because one of the things, I think this is pretty well documented with people in general. When people are under stress, when there's a lot of anxiety, their breathing tends to get more shallow and more choppy. And there tends to be tension held in their, breathing mechanism. So what's the opposite of freezing? Movement. So for me, that release of air, that diaphragm moving gets those lungs, releasing the air. So they're going back to the point where the air has all been released. So that's intensely relaxing. Relax and explode. Take that powerful breath, hit it assertively right at the top with that John Harrison style full volume. So that's what I do from the vocal side of it, is just go hard, right? No holding back, go hard, attack it. And that's a very different approach than the most common thing that, and again, I'm a dentist, not a speech therapist, but that's very different than what a lot of speech therapists, I don't want to say all, are teaching, which is a form of, taking it easy, talking like this. And I've been trained many times, and they teach you to barely hit your articulation points like this, have that soft contact. And I personally, I think that's a form of holding back. And it's not me. As John Harrison said, he wants to be him. He wants to be himself. That's when people are, and that's a big philosophical change. I mean, I don't want to call it philosophical, but in my mind, at least in my experience, that decision when I got to college, again, around the time when I got the eye contact training and started getting into that idea of being in the moment, but that idea of just be myself, be me. And who are we? Well, that's we could debate that for 50,000 years, and from a philosophical standpoint, but it seems like my unconscious or subconscious knows who I am. And when I am in that mentality, just be you. Mike, how should you be in this situation? Just be yourself. That for me tends to take care of a lot of this. And me, when I'm being me, by definition, I'm not repressing me, right? I'm just being myself. And that catchphrase for me, just be yourself, Mike, really
So,
helped me.
so would you regard yourself as an extrovert?
So, yes, because I'm excited about ideas. I'm excited, I'm excited about, like in this conversation, I'm excited about what's in your mind, and I'm excited about what's popping into my mind. So, but I do think, I mean, at times, especially when I was younger, I felt very much like an introvert, even though I knew there was an extrovert in there that wanted to get out. So I'm a little, and again, I'm a dentist, so I haven't studied this intensely, but I'm a little skeptical whether people are, quote, introverts or extroverts. I think, well, and one way to think about the Greek um, gods, right? The god of, fire and anger and, all the different gods that they have. And I had never thought of polytheism in these terms, but one way I heard it explained is what the Greeks were doing there was, on one level, communicating that we all have all of those things within us. And there's a great quote from a Native American elder. I'm not sure if they know who said this exactly, or it's a fable or something that's shared in Native American culture, which has made its way into larger culture to some extent. And I think I saw it in a movie, but where a young Native boy was asking one of the elders of the tribe, one of the wise men of the tribe, he said, "Look, the boy said, sometimes um, I feel one way, and other times I feel another way, and they are very different feelings." And the old man said, "Well, we've got multiple wolves inside of ourselves."
Mm.
And the boy said, "Well, which one am I? How do I figure out which one I really am, or who I want to be?" And the old man said, "Well, the one that you feed is the one that you're going to get more of."
Mm.
So, and I think there's a lot to this, that our actions in a lot of ways can lead our thinking. So even if we're afraid, right? Even if we're terrified of getting up to give that presentation, or we're terrified of going to ask out, that girl that we want to ask out, whatever the case may be, the action of making ourselves do it, like just doing it, feeling the fear and doing it anyway, can oftentimes pull our thinking, can pull our psychology along, where we, you know, we're feeding our inner um, hero and courageous person, rather than feeding our inner coward, is what I would say.
Mm. Yeah,
And
yeah, I agree with you. I think people are a mixture of extroverts and introverts. Definitely yes, but I also think that there is a tendency. There is a still. I mean, it's a whole spectrum of some people are extremely extrovert, some people are extremely introvert, and there's a whole range in between. But I see myself as mostly introverted, and I see where you are coming from, and but I think for people who are really more who tend to be more into the introverted side, it could be more difficult to open up and to not hold back. And I mean, I'm now in my early 70s, and though I try to to not hold back and try to be more expressive. I find it difficult. I find it contradicts my whole personality. But I'm doing my best. But I like to. I like my company most of all, and my company of my wife and my son. But I don't like crowds. I don't like parties. Things like that. I don't like too many people around me. And
Well, and Peter, let me ask you if I can. Do you, for crowds and parties and such, um, because I think the reason that and as I said, I've had times, especially in my childhood, where I hated those situations 100%. But now, so I like to learn, and so I see other people. I mean, I enjoy it. I see them on a variety of levels. But one of the reasons I like talking to people, and there's a quote I heard, I forget who said this, but I found it very useful. This idea that assume that no matter who you're talking to, you can learn something from them.
absolutely.
And I find that thirst for knowledge and thirst for seeing, and everybody's mind is probably a little bit different, right? Everybody's having different thoughts, I would imagine, is probably the way it goes. And and I'm big on the power of reframing things. So, and I'm not, I'm just talking here. Everybody, should do what they really want to do. But I wonder, and for me, when I reframe things, it can make things completely different experience. So I wonder, the next time there's a situation where there's a party, and I don't know where you guys are at with the pandemic over there, whether they're having parties again, but maybe the next time when you and your wife are invited to a party, and I'm not sure if she's more extroverted than you and would want to go to that party more than you would, perhaps, I don't know, but the next time you're on the fence, right, as to whether you're going to go to this social event or stay home by yourself, or with your wife, um, you know, um, just as an experiment, maybe one of those times when you would stay home, go to the party, and think to yourself, I'm walking into this situation with 50 other minds. How much could I possibly get out of this? Now, I would encourage people to not just do mindless small talk, right? But to actually get in, find somebody interesting and get into an interesting conversation, because I think that's where my extrovertedness comes from. I love ideas. I love ideas, and I love the uniqueness that almost everybody can potentially bring to a conversation, and how I can go to new places, right? In this conversation, I've I don't know about you, but I've gone to slightly new places, right? Like, I've thought about all this stuff, but I've never had this exact conversation before in my life. And, granted, you're more interesting probably than the average person out there for sure. But nonetheless, it's, that mentality that I can expand my knowledge base. I can expand my experience base from conversation. It's not just, do I like to talk to people or do I not? It's, actually discovering new ground, breaking new ground potentially in every conversation. So I wonder at that next party, if you go, just as a mental experiment. I'm a huge fan of mental experiments. And John Harrison and I have spoken about this, and he's somebody who said, very often that he loves talking to people. He loves conversation. And I do think some of that's natural, but I also think some of this can be discovered, if you will, even, potentially in one's 70s or 80s, because there is a lot of evidence now that, new neural patterns, so to speak, can definitely form in older adults as well.
Mm, mm, yeah.
Just an idea that I throw out there.
No, absolutely true.
But it's been a great conversation, Peter. I've thoroughly enjoyed it, man. And I apologize for keeping you so long, but I think it was worth it. So
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Mike. I think it was very, very, very learning for me too, and I admire you and your way of doing things. I think your speech is fantastic, and you honestly, I can see that you have opened up, and you are not holding back. For me at my age, it's a bit more difficult, I think, because I've been holding back for so long. But so I think age is also a factor there. But yeah, no, but thanks anyway. Thank you very
absolutely.
much.
A great conversation, and it's
Yes,
take
thank
care,
you.
and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you, Mike. All the best.
Same to you.